Welcome to pipedrive. I'm Miguel. I've been working in pipedrive for 5 years, almost 6. Fun fact, I'm actually older even than the Prague office. I started working in Lisbon, and then I moved to Prague like 2 years ago, more or less. So I've been here for some time. Here, I mean, in pipedrive. And today, I will bring you a question that I've asked myself quite a few times while I've been developing my components. In case you didn't know this, will it rerender? It's actually React components, if those components will render. And I have a little animation even of React being spinning. So let's start very basically what actually means rendering or re-rendering. Well, it's just you have your function component, and it's actually when that function is actually called. So in this component, if that function is called, the component will render. That's very basic. Start very slow. That's pretty much it. If you call that function, the component re-renders. So also like the basics of React. You have a state, it changes, you call the update state, set the counter to whatever, and it's different from before. The component, it will render, right? Everyone kind of knows this, the most basic of the React stuff. Data state, your component will render, right? It's very basic stuff. Parent renders, so this component here called parent component. If it re-renders, right, if this function is called, this child component, will it re-render? Well, the answer is yes, it will. If the parent re-renders, the child component will always re-render as well. And it's like if you think about it in like normal JavaScript, this is just a function, right? So even though that's JSX, the child component, that return child component actually means it's actually an object. So you call a function that returns an object, it's creating a new object every time. React is re-rendering something new every time. So makes sense as well, right? So every time you call the parent renders, the child will always re-render as well. And the same thing exactly if you have multiple childs. Parent re-renders, all those childs, all of that will render as well. So next one, state changes. You have here 2 different components, same component, another component. They are getting like a value from the context, like this. If this value changes, whatever component uses it will also like re-render, right? Both of these components will re-render because they're getting the value from the state. It changes, React will trigger a render. Very basic stuff. The lines are getting a bit crazier, but don't worry, they will get worse as it goes by. Here, very similar example, slightly different. We have 2 different components, the title and the description component. They're fetching their data from this post context. But even though they're getting different properties from inside the post text value, whatever is there, they will still both re-render if only one of these properties will change. So if the title changes, both of the description component and the title component will change. So change to the context will trigger a change, whatever the properties you're using from that context, right? So also still very basic. Again, kind of custom hooks. So we have like this super counter, which, oh, you're not supposed to see that. Super counter, use super counter. It's using the state and the context, which means, and then you have a component that uses this custom hook. If the state changes in this like custom hook, the component will re-render, right? Makes sense. We've seen this already from before. If the value from the constant also changes, the same also triggers a re-render from the component that's using this custom hook. And it's the same whatever nesting you have here. If you have this use super counter using some other different custom hook, and it somehow, for some reason, should trigger render, it will always trigger render for whoever uses that. So still like pretty basic. I guess everyone that does React kind of knows this stuff, right? It's still normal stuff. And now we have here props change. So I have this counter component, and this prop changed. And well, even I'd like to ask that, will this component re-render? if anyone was to ask, or I can just answer it as well. Well, the truth is it will, but it's not actually because the counter changed. It's this component will re-render because the only way for the counter to change is if the parent actually rendered. So React components do not care if the props changed because they can only change if the parent re-renders. So like quick example, component that has a use state with a counter, this will not, if you update the counter component will not re-render because the counter state changed. It will re-render because this component, the parent, it updated, so it will update its children with the new value. Okay, so makes sense as well, right? Okay, so here we have like more of an exercise. We have this component. There's a button. I put there a big B only because I'm kind of used to write this design systems buttons that we have. So I ended up just writing the way we usually do. But imagine this is like a normal HTML button, and it's like one of those very typical things that you have in your application, which is a counter button. Like you press it, and it shows a different number every time. Typical stuff. Like you press it, state changes. Like what will happen, right? The parent component re-renders. Like these two, both, I guess that's like your whatever this design systems button re-render. And also, in case you didn't notice, this big prime number counter component, it means it's actually like slow to render. So you don't want to render every time, right? So let's like slightly change it, extract the state into a separate component with the button, with the counter. Now you update the state, and will it re-render on the parent component? This one, the counter button, will re-render, but oh wait, but yeah, but not the component, the parent component, because they're siblings. The component doesn't have to change. There's nothing that's triggering the big prime number counter component to re-render, right? Still, kind of basic, right? Easy peasy, should be pretty obvious. So now here we have a component. Again, it has a div with onOver. Imagine like that onOver doesn't exist in React, right? Imagine that's on mouse enter, it returns true, and on mouse leave returns false. So it's kind of like you go in, it will return true, go out false. So every time you over it, it would set this visible state to true, go out to false. Here we have again our big prime number counter component, and I want to show like a little info because sometimes I forget what prime numbers are. So I'll have it like a little info there. And what will happen if I over this component? Like this one will render because if the component updates, if the state updates, the parent component will re-render, which will trigger the render of the big prime counter component. But I can kind of move things around. Like, so I have now here, I called it a tooltip. And I just extracted the code from there into a separate component. And now I'm passing a prop children, and I'm rendering the children there, or putting the children there in the GSX. And like if I render this div, if I over this div, again, very similar to what was done before. But now I kind of I'm composing like these components, right? So what will happen if I over this div? Which components should we render in this case? So like this one will definitely re-render, right? Like it changed, the state of it inside changed, but will the big prime number counter component re-render? The answer is it won't. It will not re-render because the big prime number, it's like nothing made it re-render. Nothing changed in its parent. Like it's just being passed as a children to this tooltip component will which we render, but like the value of the children is still there. It's the same. Like it didn't change. Like this component here didn't change the big prime counter component. Like nothing made it change. Like there's nothing here in React that makes this component change. So even though the tooltip changed, it's prop. Like it's a prop, the children. It didn't change. So the tooltip will render, but the big prime number counter will not. It might seem kind of weird, but especially because we're using the name children, and before I said that the parent component always renders its children, but this component's parent, it's this one. It's not that one. Okay, does it make sense? So the big prime number will not re-render in this case. Okay, I don't know, like if at some point anyone has some like questions, they can ask, or if it's not clear. But moving forward, React memo. What is very like simple? Start with what is React memo? It's basically just a way to change the behavior of like a component to actually make it only re-render if their props change. If their props change and the component is memoized, then it will actually re-render. So the previous case that we've seen before, I have here a parent component. I return the child component. If the parent component re-renders, the child component should re-render. But if I memoize the child component, if the parent component re-renders in this specific case, it takes no props. So it just will not re-render. It will render the first time only, and then it will not re-render ever again unless I pass it some props. Still, like very basic. Memoized children will not re-render even if the py re-renders unless the props change. Oh yeah, re-renders does not re-render. Makes sense, right? Okay, so here we have similar thing as before. Like we're memoizing the child component, and we're passing him a value, or we're passing him a prop. And this prop is an object. It's an object with some like static values inside, some ID 1, value 10. And so if the parent component re-renders, will the child memo re-renders? Yes. The answer, as I heard someone, this value will change because in JavaScript, you run a function, the counter will change every time because it's an object. It's not a primitive value. If this counter was just 10 or 1, it wouldn't change. It would not re-render, but since it's an object, it will re-render. So like if we make slight alteration for this to be like this, now we're memoizing our children, but we're also using the React use memo, which is kind of similar, or it is an application of memoizing just as React memo. But here we're memoizing an actual value. So it means that if you have a value, and in this case, and if usually you pass it some dependencies, you pass it on the array that's empty there. This array is empty. This value will never change except for the first time it is created. So if this re-renders, this value doesn't change. So the child memo will not re-render because it's the same value. There's actually there's a mistake here. I don't know if someone noticed it, but if you notice, you can point it out. If not, I'll say that the use memo actually expects a function except of a value, like an object there. So that's a mistake. Another example here. I have a parent component. Nothing is memoized here except for the counter data. Exactly the same. But I have a child component here receiving directly the memoized data. Will this child component re-render? The answer is yes. The child component is not memoized. So even though the counter is memoized and will always return the same data, if the parent re-renders, the child re-renders, as we've seen before. So it doesn't matter if you pass it always the exact same data, it will always re-render as well. OK, so we have here back like the same example from before. I just made the big prime number counter name a bit shorter because it was getting kind of hard to always write it down. But the same but now we are memoizing the tooltip. We're passing it down the big prime number counter component to it, which is not memoized. And the parent of them both re-render. So what will happen in this case? Maybe we should go step by step from what we know. Yeah, the tooltip is a memo, so it should not re-render, right? The value is already there, so it's fine. Will not re-render. However, the big prime component, it will re-render. It's not a memo, right? So its parent re-rendered. so it will render itself as well. But now, the big prime component is actually a prop of the tooltip memo. We're just writing it in this way. But if we wrote it like tooltip memo children equals brackets prime component, it would be the same. So the big prime component, it's a prop of the tooltip memo. So it will re-render, actually. So yeah, it re-renders. Very similar, but rememorizing the big prime memo, the component re-renders for some reason. The tooltip, yeah, it will render, right? However, the big prime memo does not re-render because it has no reason to. Props didn't change, it's memoized, it's fine. So in this case, if you want to not re-render any of those, you need to memoize them both, even if you're passing it down. To not have them re-render, like both the tooltip memo or both the tooltip and the big prime component would need to be memoized. So there's a lot of more cases or very other things that can happen in React, but I guess we are ready to answer the question that I posed when we start this talk, which is, will it re-render? And the answer is, yes, it will. But it's not a problem. Sometimes we all re-render. So it's OK. You don't need to go and wrap all your components React memo. If you have a performance issue, maybe that's a solution. But most times, it's not even React's fault. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for coming. One last shout out to Nadia Marakovic and her blog, Developer Way. That's where I learned all of this. And you should definitely check it out and actually see it much better explained than what I've said. So thank you. Thank you.